They took my mother's house on the coldest morning of the year, when even the walls seemed to shrink. I thought the grief had already finished its work on me, until I heard the floor creak where it never had before. The house sat at the edge of town, weathered and quiet, holding the shape of my childhood like a held breath. My mother had lived there alone for years, stitched into the place as surely as the warped boards and faded wallpaper. After her death, winter arrived early, and with it, men who spoke softly and carried papers that said the house no longer belonged to us. I stayed only because leaving felt like another kind of loss. The snow was falling straight down that morning. No wind. No sound. Just white moving slowly past the window like it had all the time in the world. I was standing at the sink, waiting for the kettle to remember itself. It hadn't started to sing yet, but the house already felt awake. Old houses do that. They listen before they speak. The mailbox clicked shut outside. A small sound. Enough to pull me from the window. By the time I opened the door, the cold had already stepped inside. The porch boards were slick, the air sharp enough to sting my eyes. The envelope sat there alone, pale against the dark metal, folded too neatly. Government neat. The kind of neat that never brings good news. I didn't open it right away. I brought it inside and laid it on the kitchen table, smoothing it once with my palm like it might wrinkle if I didn't. Snow clung to the edges of my coat and melted onto the floor. The kettle clicked again. Still quiet. That table had been my mother's. Not in the legal sense, just in the way some things belong to people long after they're gone. She used to sit there in the afternoons, a bowl of peas between her elbows, hands moving without looking. Pop, pause. Drop. The knife marks were still there, shallow and pale, like a map of small, ordinary days. I traced one with my thumb while the envelope waited. The house felt smaller all of a sudden. I told myself that was just the cold. I opened the letter carefully, like it might cut me if I rushed. The paper was stiff, the words printed too cleanly to be personal. Reclaimed. Outstanding taxes. Final notice. Deadlines passed. They had a way of stacking the words so none of them had to take responsibility. I read it once. Then again, slower. The kettle began to scream, sharp and startled, and I let it go on longer than I should have. Steam filled the air, fogging the window above the sink. For a moment, the outside disappeared. Just me, the table, and that letter telling me the house no longer belonged to us. I sat down. The chair creaked under my weight, the same familiar complaint it had always made. I wondered if it remembered her too. How she used to rock back slightly when she laughed. How she always tucked her foot under the rung like she was bracing herself. The letter said this had been coming for some time. That was the part that caught in my chest. Not the money. Not the threat. The time. How long had this been waiting without me knowing? I tried to think back. The last year of her life came to me in pieces. The way she'd started stacking mail instead of opening it, the careful way she'd changed the subject when I asked if everything was handled. She'd always been proud. Quiet about needing help. I folded the letter back the way it had come, sharp edges meeting perfectly. My hands were steady, but my chest felt hollow, like something had slipped out when I wasn't paying attention. Outside, an engine hummed. I looked up. A truck sat down the road, not parked exactly, just idling. White with no markings I could see from the window. It hadn't been there earlier. I would have noticed. This house trained you to notice things. The truck didn't move. I told myself it was nothing. Someone warming up. Someone waiting for the snow to ease. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was patient in a way people usually aren't. I carried my mug to the table and didn't drink. The coffee smelled thin, like it had brewed too fast. I stared at the letter again, at the address printed cleanly where my mother's handwriting should have been. She used to write my name with a small hook at the end of the Y, careful. Deliberate. This wasn't that. The walls seemed closer now. Not pressing exactly. Just aware. The tick of the clock over the doorway sounded louder than it ever had. Each second landed hard, like it expected something from me. I wondered when the house had learned. Houses know before people do. They hear conversations through walls, feel the weight of unopened mail in drawers. They notice when footsteps change, when voices soften around certain subjects. I stood and walked the length of the room, touching things as I passed. The counter she'd scrubbed every night. The window latch she never quite trusted. The small crack in the corner where winter always found its way in first. Nothing looked different. That was the hardest part. Loss doesn't always arrive with broken glass or raised voices. Sometimes it comes folded neatly, waiting in a mailbox while snow falls without sound. I went back to the window. The truck was still there. A man sat inside, one hand on the wheel, head turned slightly toward the house. Not watching exactly. Just present. Like he knew the moment would come when I'd look back. Our eyes didn't meet. He didn't wave. The kettle finally went quiet on its own. I turned it off, poured the water out, and left the mug empty on the counter. My reflection hovered faintly in the glass, older than I remembered. Tired in a way sleep doesn't fix. I thought about my mother that winter she fell on the ice and laughed instead of crying. The way she'd said, "Well, that's one way to slow down." The way she never complained, even when things pressed in on her. Had she known this letter was coming? The idea settled heavy in my stomach. I gathered the rest of the mail and slid it into the drawer where she used to keep scissors and twine. The drawer stuck halfway, as it always had. I gave it the same firm push she used to. It slid closed with a soft knock. Outside, the truck door opened. I didn't look right away. I stood in the middle of the kitchen, listening to my own breathing, to the faint tick of the clock, to the house holding still around me. There are moments when a place feels like it's waiting to see what you'll do next. This was one of them. When I finally looked out, the man had stepped back into the truck. The engine revved slightly, then settled. Snow gathered on the hood, softening its shape. Not yet, I thought. Whatever this was, whatever had been set in motion, it wasn't finished with me. Not yet. I folded the letter one more time and slipped it into my coat pocket, close to where my heart beat too fast. The paper felt thin. Fragile. But it was heavy all the same. The house creaked once, low and slow, like it was clearing its throat. And for the first time that morning, I had the strange feeling that this wasn't the beginning of the end, but the end of something being kept quiet for far too long. The frost had climbed the windows overnight. Not in a hurry. Just enough to leave its signature. It traced soft flowers along the glass my mother had always said she'd replace in the spring. Every spring, she said it again. The kind of promise that didn't need keeping to feel true. I stood there a long moment, coat still hanging on the back of the chair, watching my breath cloud the kitchen air. The heat hadn't reached this room yet. Or maybe it had, and the cold was just stubborn. Either way, the house felt awake before I was. I set the first box on the table and folded the flaps inward, the cardboard bending with a tired sound. The box smelled like dust and something faintly sweet, old linen, maybe. Or time. I couldn't tell the difference anymore. Packing is a strange kind of remembering. You don't go looking for memories. They find you. A dish towel came first. Then another. I wrapped them the way she had taught me, corners tucked in tight, even when no one was watching. She used to say neatness was a kind of kindness. I hadn't understood that until later. The kettle sat cold on the stove. I left it there. Each room held a version of her, waiting quietly like a reflection you don't expect to see. In the living room, her chair faced the window, angled just enough to catch the afternoon light. She'd refused to throw it away even after the armrest split open and the stuffing showed through like a small wound. "It's still good," she'd said, patting it once. Final. I pressed my hand to the fabric before moving on. It held the shape of her better than any photograph. The clock on the mantel had stopped months ago. I hadn't wound it since she passed. I couldn't bring myself to hear it measure time again. Now, in the quiet, it ticked anyway, just once, as if to remind me it was still there. I packed slowly. Not because there was much left, but because I didn't know where to go when I finished. The hallway felt narrower than usual, the light dim even with the curtains open. My footsteps sounded too loud on the floorboards. They creaked the way they always had, but today the sound lingered, as if the house was repeating itself back to me. I stopped there, halfway between her room and the back door. I don't know what made me pause. There was no noise. No sudden thought. Just a heaviness in my legs, like the floor had learned how to hold me in place. The walls felt close again. Not pressing. Just aware. I looked down at the floor, at the narrow planks running lengthwise, worn smooth where years of walking had passed. I remembered how she used to stand here in the mornings, tying her shoes slowly, humming without meaning to. The hum echoed faintly in my head now. I told myself it was just grief. Grief does strange things to time, to space. It makes doorways feel farther away than they are. Still, I didn't move. I carried the last box into her bedroom instead. The bed was already stripped, the sheets folded into a neat square on the dresser. I lifted them and caught the scent of her soap, the kind she bought in bulk because she liked knowing it would last. The closet door stuck halfway open. I tugged it free and reached for her coats. One by one, they came off the hanger, heavier than they should have been. Each pocket held something small and ordinary. A tissue. A receipt. A button. I left those where they were. Some things felt too personal to disturb. The box filled quickly after that. Shoes. A scarf. The hat she wore every winter, even indoors. When I pressed it down, the cardboard bowed slightly, like it was making room. I taped the box shut and set it by the door. The house had gone very quiet. Even the distant road noise seemed to hold back, as if it had learned to be polite here. I returned to the hallway and stood in the same spot as before. The pause came again, stronger this time. My feet felt rooted, my body listening for something I couldn't name. I placed my palm on the wall. The paint was cool. Smooth in places, uneven in others where she'd patched it herself instead of calling someone. She always said it was easier to fix things if you didn't make a fuss. I closed my eyes. The house settled around me, a low groan moving through the beams. Old houses speak when they're alone with you. Not in words. In weight. In memory. I thought of all the mornings she'd stood right where I was now, looking down the hall, deciding what needed doing first. The house had always answered her. Was it answering me now? I stepped forward. The floor creaked differently this time. Not louder. Just lower. A sound that didn't belong to this spot. I stopped again, heart picking up speed without permission. I bent slightly, pressing my foot down more firmly. The board shifted just enough to notice. I straightened up, suddenly unsure of myself. This wasn't the moment for discoveries. Not today. Today was for leaving quietly. For closing doors without slamming them. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted beneath me. I took one more step, careful now, and felt the same give. Subtle. Almost polite. The house held its breath. I exhaled. Later, I said, not sure who I was speaking to. I finished packing in a kind of fog after that. The boxes lined the wall like silent witnesses, each one carrying a piece of her that wouldn't fit anywhere else. When I reached the front door, I turned back once more. The hallway waited, unchanged, ordinary as ever. But I knew better now. Some things don't announce themselves. They wait. I pulled on my coat, the fabric stiff with cold, and lifted the first box. It felt heavier than before. Or maybe I was just tired. Outside, the frost still clung to the windows, softening the world beyond them. The flowers on the glass caught the light and held it, delicate and stubborn. I stepped onto the porch and let the door close behind me, careful not to rush it. The house creaked once, low and familiar. And for the first time that morning, I wondered if it wasn't grief keeping me there at all. But the quiet knowledge that I hadn't finished listening yet. They arrived just after noon. That quiet hour when the day hasn't decided what it wants to be yet. Snow clung to their boots in heavy clumps, melting onto the porch boards where my mother once shook out rugs every spring. The sound of it, wet, uneven, reached me before their voices did. I was standing by the front window, watching the light shift across the yard, when the truck door closed with a soft finality. I didn't open the door right away. The house felt still, like it was holding its breath for me. When I did open it, the cold slipped in first. Sharp. Familiar. One of the men smiled, the kind of smile that comes pre-packaged with bad news. Polite. Careful. He said my name like he'd practiced it in the truck. Afternoon, he said. I nodded and stepped aside. That felt easier than speaking. They moved through the doorway slowly, respectfully, as if speed might be mistaken for cruelty. Their coats brushed the frame, and for a moment I thought of how many times my mother had measured that doorway with groceries balanced on her hip, laughing when she bumped the edge. The men didn't look at the walls, or the pictures, or the floor. They stood where I told them to stand. The kitchen was cold again. I hadn't turned the heat up. The light coming through the window was pale and thin, the kind that makes everything feel unfinished. One of the men set his folder on the table, right where my mother used to rest her elbows. He cleared his throat. "I'm sorry about your loss," he said, eyes fixed somewhere over my shoulder. I thanked him. Automatically. The other man reached into his coat and pulled out papers, smoothing them once before setting them down. The sound of paper on wood felt louder than it should have. Everything sounded louder now. "This won't take long," he said. I stood across from them, hands tucked into my sleeves, fingers numb. Not just from the cold. From the weight of the moment. I'd known they were coming. The letter had been clear. Still, knowing and watching are different things. He slid the receipt toward me. It was a simple thing. Thin. Official. Ink stamped where ink always goes. A receipt for a life I couldn't argue back. I picked it up and read my name printed neatly at the top. Below it, an address I'd known longer than I'd known myself. Below that, words that reduced decades to a few lines. The man pointed gently to the bottom. "Just here," he said. My hand shook when I signed. Not much. Just enough to leave a small wobble in the ink. I told myself it was the cold. The house was drafty. Everyone knew that. The man nodded and took the paper back without comment. He placed it in his folder, aligning the edges carefully, as if order might soften what came next. "We'll need the keys now," the first man said. I reached into my pocket and felt the familiar shape. Cool metal. Worn smooth where my mother's thumb had rested for years. She used to keep them on a ribbon instead of a ring, said it was easier to find in her purse. I placed them in his open palm. For a moment, no one moved. Then he closed his fingers around them. The sound of the lock turning came later. Not immediately. They walked to the door together, boots leaving damp prints on the floor. I followed at a distance, every step deliberate, as if the house might disappear if I rushed. When the key slid into the lock, the click echoed down the hallway. Loud. Final. It bounced off the walls and came back to me different, like the house didn't recognize it. I swallowed. The man tested the handle once, just to be sure. He nodded, satisfied, and stepped aside. His partner avoided my eyes as he handed me a copy of the paperwork. "Take care," he said. I watched them leave without speaking. The door closed behind them, sealing in the quiet. Their footsteps faded down the porch steps, then across the yard. The truck engine started, low and patient, before pulling away. Snow fell again, softening their tracks almost immediately. I stood there long after the sound was gone. The house felt altered. Not empty. Just different. Like something essential had been interrupted mid-sentence. I walked to the hallway and touched the wall, half expecting it to be warm. It wasn't. Just paint and plaster. Still, my hand lingered there, as if memory might rise to meet it. I wondered what exactly had been sealed inside. The rooms were unchanged. The chair still faced the window. The clock still refused to tick. My mother's coat still hung on the hook by the door, its pocket heavy with something I hadn't yet checked. And yet, the air felt held. I moved from room to room slowly, noticing the way sound behaved now. My footsteps didn't carry as far. The creak near the stairs answered me too quickly, like it was nervous. In the kitchen, the table waited with its familiar scars. The chair I'd used that morning sat pushed back slightly, as if someone had just stood up. I sat down again. The receipt lay folded in my coat pocket. I didn't take it out. I didn't need to see it to know what it said. Outside, the light shifted. Noon leaning toward afternoon. The snow easing into something finer, almost hopeful. I thought about my mother standing at this very door years ago, arguing gently with a salesman who wanted to replace the roof. The way she'd smiled and said, "It's holding just fine." The way she believed things could endure if you paid them enough attention. Had she known this day was coming? The question settled in the room and stayed. I went to the door and placed my hand on the knob. The metal was cold, unfamiliar now that it no longer answered to me. I didn't turn it. I just stood there, breathing, listening to the house breathe back. Somewhere beneath my feet, the floor shifted. Not a creak. A settling. The sound carried weight, like something deeper had adjusted itself. I stepped back, heart thudding quietly, and glanced down the hallway. Nothing looked different. And yet, the feeling remained, that something had been closed off before it was finished speaking. I picked up my coat and slipped it on, moving carefully, as if the house might startle. When I reached for the door again, I paused. "Not yet," I whispered. I wasn't sure why. The house didn't answer. But it didn't protest either. Outside, the snow kept falling, steady and patient, covering what had just happened. I pulled the door shut behind me, letting the lock click into place from the other side this time. The sound echoed again. Too loud. And as I stood on the porch, keys gone, house sealed, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever they'd locked away wasn't finished with me. That some truths don't stay quiet just because someone turns a key. I should have left that day. Anyone sensible would have. The light was already thinning by the time the men drove away, and winter doesn't forgive hesitation. Still, I stayed. I told myself it was because the roads would ice over. Because it would be safer in the morning. But the truth was quieter than that. Winter has a way of trapping people inside their own thoughts. I laid my mother's quilt on the living room floor, smoothing it flat with both hands. The fabric was worn soft, the colors faded into something gentler than they used to be. I remembered her stitching it at this very spot, needle flashing in the lamplight, radio low so she wouldn't miss the weather. "Cold's coming," she'd say, not unkindly, just observant. I slept there with my coat folded beneath my head, the house dark except for the faint orange glow from the streetlight outside. Shadows moved slowly across the ceiling as cars passed, stretching and shrinking like memories that didn't know where to settle. The house made its nighttime sounds. Pipes ticking. Wood sighing. The low, patient breathing of something that had stood longer than I had lived. Wrapped in the quilt, I felt smaller than I had all day. The cold crept up from the floor, but the quilt held, the way it always had. It smelled like her laundry soap and a little like dust. Comfort and age woven together. I listened. Old houses talk when the world goes quiet. You just have to learn which sounds to trust. The stair creak came once, right on time, as if someone invisible was heading up to bed. The wind tested the window frames gently, then moved on. I closed my eyes. Sleep came in pieces. I dreamed of nothing I could remember, just the feeling of waiting, of standing in a hallway that kept getting longer the more I walked. When the creak woke me, it was still dark. Not the familiar one by the stairs. This was lower. Slower. Deeper in the house. I lay still, heart thudding softly, listening for it again. The house settled around me, a long exhale moving through the beams. Then silence. I sat up, the quilt slipping from my shoulders. The floor was cold against my palms when I leaned forward. The air smelled sharper now, like morning hadn't decided to arrive yet. The sound came again. A muted shift. Almost a sigh. It came from the hallway. I stood and padded barefoot toward it, every step careful. The floorboards were darker here, worn thin by years of passing. The same spot where I'd paused earlier, unable to explain why. I crouched and pressed my palm to the floor. The wood felt different beneath my hand. Not loose exactly. Just hollow. As if the house was keeping something just out of reach. I pressed again, firmer this time. There it was. A soft give. My breath caught without asking permission. This wasn't new damage. This wasn't rot or age. The floorboard was solid at the edges, but the center answered back too easily. Like a secret learned how to breathe. I pulled my hand away and sat back on my heels, suddenly aware of how quiet it was. Even the house seemed to be listening now. Why hadn't my mother mentioned this? She mentioned everything. The crack in the wall that let cold air in. The loose hinge on the back door. The way the porch step sagged when it rained. She would have noticed this. I ran my fingers along the seam between boards, tracing the line carefully. The dust settled into my skin, fine and grey. My nails caught on something almost invisible, the slightest lip where one board met another. My heart slowed, then sped up again. I stood and fetched the flashlight from my coat pocket. The beam cut a narrow path across the floor, catching on scratches and stains I'd seen 1,000 times. But here, the light revealed something else. A hairline gap. Intentional. I sat back down, the quilt pooling around my legs like a quiet witness. My thoughts moved carefully now, as if any sudden movement might spook whatever lived beneath the floor. Had she hidden something here? The idea felt wrong at first. My mother wasn't secretive. She believed in telling the truth plainly, even when it hurt. Especially then. And yet, I thought of the mail she used to stack without opening. The way she'd grown tired faster in that last year. The gentle deflections when I asked if everything was handled. "Don't fuss," she'd say. "It's fine." I pressed my palm to the board again, slower this time. The hollow answered. The house creaked softly, not in protest. More like encouragement. I glanced toward the front door, half expecting it to open, to hear those boots again. But the door stayed closed. The lock held. The world outside remained unaware. I slid the flashlight aside and rested my forehead briefly against my knee. Some things reveal themselves only when you're quiet enough to hear them. I didn't pry the board up. Not yet. I wasn't ready for whatever waited there. Discovery carries responsibility, and I needed a moment to remember how to hold that. Instead, I lay back down on the quilt, closer to the hallway now. The floor beneath me felt different. Charged. As if it knew I was listening. Sleep didn't come easily after that. I watched the ceiling lighten inch by inch as dawn made its slow approach. The frost on the windows caught the first grey light, the flowers etched their glowing faintly before fading. The house shifted again, gentler this time. Familiar. Like it was settling into the day. When the sun finally reached the hallway, it stopped just short of that spot on the floor. The light edged around it, leaving a small shadow where my hand had been. I stood and brushed the dust from my palms. Whatever this was, it had waited a long time. And as I gathered the quilt and folded it the way she always had, corners tucked, seams aligned, I understood something quietly, without relief or fear. My mother hadn't mentioned this spot. Because some truths don't ask to be spoken. They wait. And now, standing there in the thin winter light, I knew I wasn't meant to leave just yet. Not while the house still had something to say. The morning light fell pale across the kitchen floor. Slanted through the frost on the windows, it pooled in the corners, touching dust and scratches in a way I hadn't noticed before. I knelt down beside the hallway board, fingers tracing its edges, careful, hesitant. It looked ordinary. Nothing about it invited attention. But the weight in my chest told me otherwise. I picked up the kitchen knife. Not a proper tool, just the one we used to slice bread. The metal was cold against my palm. I hesitated longer than I should have, breathing shallow and slow. This wasn't strength the task demanded. It was patience. And a little bit of courage I didn't know I had. I pressed the blade between the board and the floor. The wood resisted at first. Dust lifted like ash, swirling in the light. It smelled of everything old. Smoke, paper, the faint perfume my mother used to dab behind her ears. I swallowed, hand trembling, and eased it further, inch by inch. The board shifted. A soft sigh of movement that sounded almost like a whisper. I froze. The house creaked, low and patient, as if it were holding its breath with me. Beneath the loosened board lay a small envelope. Edges browned with time. The paper stiff, fragile, yet dignified. I reached for it with both hands. My fingertips brushed the envelope's surface. My mother's handwriting was unmistakable. Careful, precise, deliberate. I traced the letters with my thumb, memorizing the curves. My name was written on the front, slowly, deliberately, as if she had practiced it before committing it to ink. A chill ran through me. How long had this been waiting? How long had she folded it, hid it, trusted that someday I would find it? I lifted the envelope gently, letting it rest on the floor in front of me. The dust settled around it like a small cloud, carrying a weight of decades. I didn't open it right away. I couldn't. I let my hands rest on the floorboard instead. It felt hollow underneath, like a secret the house had been carrying patiently all this time. I pressed my palm down, feeling the slight give of the wood. It answered me quietly. A reminder that time bends, but memories do not fade. The light shifted across the room. I could see the grain of the floor, the cracks where my mother had patched it herself, the faint stains from cups and spills she never bothered to scrub completely. All of it familiar. All of it still hers. I finally picked up the envelope again. It fit in my hands like it was waiting for me to cradle it. The paper smelled of age, of care, of everything that had been left unsaid. I turned it over slowly, reluctant, as if the act of opening might break something. I slid the flap back. The paper inside was folded carefully, deliberately. I unfolded it and let it fall open, the sound soft against the quiet house. The words were hers. Every letter, every sentence. Even in print, I could hear her voice, calm, measured, steady. She wrote about things I hadn't known. Small betrayals hidden beneath polite words. Promises broken by people who smiled too easily. Money diverted without notice. Letters that had been sent and ignored. Everything she had carried quietly in her final years. I read each line slowly, tasting the weight of it, feeling the heaviness settle into my chest. The envelope had waited for me. It had waited for the day I could finally understand. I folded it back carefully. Not because I didn't want to read it again, but because some things demand patience. They ask you to pause and hold them gently, even when your fingers ache. I pressed the envelope back into the hollow space beneath the floorboard. It fit perfectly, as if it had been meant to stay there, waiting. The wood settled back into place with a soft click. The dust floated down and rested, quiet and still. I sank to my knees. The house seemed to exhale. Every creak, every groan, every sigh of settling timber carried a quiet understanding. It wasn't just the envelope. It was everything my mother had trusted me with. I placed my forehead against the floorboard. Cold. Solid. Certain. And I whispered, though no one else could hear. "Thank you, Mama." The sunlight moved further across the room, brushing the envelope with faint light that seeped through the cracks in the wood. I left it where it was. Some things are meant to be discovered slowly, gently, like snow melting in quiet streams. I stood and brushed my hands against my knees. The room felt different now. Not empty. Not lonely. But lighter, and still heavy with a secret kept for decades. I walked to the window and looked outside. The frost had begun to melt in the morning sun, little rivulets of water tracing patterns along the glass. The world beyond the house felt ordinary. Unchanged. Yet, inside, everything had shifted. I turned back toward the board. It looked like any other board now. But I knew better. I had seen what waited beneath. The envelope's presence lingered in the air. A quiet pulse beneath the floorboards. The house seemed to hum softly, a voice that only I could hear. I took a deep breath. Not to steady my hands. Not to prepare for what came next. But to carry the knowledge that some truths are meant to be held quietly. I touched the floor once more before leaving. The dust, the hollow, the hidden paper, they had taught me patience, even when it hurt. And as I walked toward the kitchen, the sunlight catching on the edges of the floorboard, I felt the weight of her waiting lift just slightly. I didn't know what would happen after this. I only knew I had found her, in the quietest way possible. And that, for now, was enough. The house was quiet, but it felt alive. Every creak of the floor, every sigh of the walls, answered me in its own way. I sat on the living room floor, the envelope resting in my lap, my knees drawn up, quilt pooling around me. The morning light filtered weakly through the frost on the windows, soft and grey, catching the edges of the paper. Dust drifted lazily in the shafts of light, motes that seemed to pause when I did. I unfolded the letter slowly. The paper smelled of age and laundry soap, familiar and intimate, like my mother's presence pressed into the fibers. Her handwriting was exact, careful, deliberate. Each letter shaped as if she had taken her time, though her hand must have trembled in the final months. I read the first line aloud, softly, as if speaking might make it less real. She wrote about money. Lost. Taken. Diverted without her knowledge. But it wasn't just numbers. It was trust betrayed, quietly, by people who had smiled too easily and spoken too kindly. I felt each sentence press into my chest. She wrote about promises made and broken. Small ones, like neighbors returning borrowed tools, and larger ones, legal, financial, silent contracts that had left her powerless. She documented signatures forged in her absence. Letters she had tried to send, ignored, or intercepted. Each line bore the weight of someone's careful deception, and the weight of her endurance. I ran my finger along the paper, tracing a word here, a comma there. She had written this for me to find. And I hadn't known. Not a hint. Not a whisper. She wrote about trust, about the wrong people, the ones who spoke gently while taking everything. She detailed meetings, phone calls, letters. People she had given her confidence to, thinking kindness could protect her. It hadn't. The words blurred at first, and I blinked, wiping tears I hadn't expected. Her voice was steady across the page, calm and precise. She didn't scold. She didn't plead. She told the truth, quietly, as she had always done. Why hide this from me? I asked the question aloud, but the house did not answer. The clock on the mantel ticked once. The floor creaked somewhere by the stairs. The walls seemed to lean in, listening. I read the next paragraph. She described her fear of losing everything, not just the house, not just the money, but the dignity of knowing what she had built. She was ill. She was tired. And yet she fought in the only way she could, quietly, with words preserved on paper, waiting for the right hands to find them. I ran my thumb over her handwriting again. The loops of letters, the careful spacing, the flourish at the end of my name, each stroke deliberate, intentional. This letter wasn't just information. It was her. I paused. The weight of the letter seemed heavier than the weight of the envelope alone. Each sentence carried years, small and large betrayals alike, and the courage it had taken to write them down. I pressed the paper to my chest. The dust rose again in the faint light, floating around me like a quiet snow. I folded the letter slowly and reopened it. I wanted to memorize her voice, the way it moved between anger, sorrow, and stubborn clarity. She described names I recognized, faces I had trusted, details I could almost see in the corners of memory. People who had smiled at her funeral. People who had offered condolences while carrying secrets. The house shifted, a low groan of settling timber. I looked up, half expecting to see her, standing quietly in the corner. The quilt around me smelled faintly of her perfume, of dust, of patience. It was enough to feel her there, even if only for a moment. I kept reading. She wrote about things she had kept silent about because she didn't want to worry me. Things she had tried to solve quietly, so that I might never have to carry the burden. And yet, here it was, laid bare in ink, waiting for me to find it. Each paragraph sank into me. I felt the weight of her trust, the carefulness of her hiding, the courage of her decision. I had imagined her as frail, as silent, as defeated in the last months of her life. But this letter proved otherwise. She had fought. She had fought with pens and paper instead of fists. I traced the words again, whispering her sentences softly under my breath. It was almost like reading a confession and a love letter at the same time. Love for her life, for her home, for me. And the quiet sorrow of knowing kindness could be dangerous. The light shifted across the floor as the sun climbed higher. Shadows stretched along the walls and paused on her chair. I didn't want to move. The letter had rooted me in place, in the space between her and me, between the past and the reality I now faced. I folded the paper once, carefully, letting it rest on my knees. I could feel her presence in every stroke, in every sentence left unsaid aloud. The envelope under my fingers was warm from my touch, fragile, like a small heartbeat. I wondered how many times she had held it before she placed it beneath the floorboard. How long she had hoped I would understand, that I would be patient enough to find it. I pressed the envelope again to my chest, listening to the quiet house breathe around me. The words lingered longer than I expected. I didn't feel anger. Not yet. Not the kind you can name. Just a slow, sinking awareness of the trust she had given me and the betrayal she had endured alone. I let the letter fall open again, letting my fingers rest lightly on the page. I read the sentences I had already read, letting them sink in like water into dry wood. The house creaked, subtle and low, as if it, too, was reading over my shoulder. I pressed the edge of the paper to my lips, quiet, almost reverent. Her handwriting was a bridge. A small, delicate bridge over time, over absence, over everything she had tried to protect me from. I folded the letter one last time, careful, deliberate, and placed it back in the envelope. The dust settled around me. The light caught the edges of the paper one final time. I stayed on the floor a long time after that, listening. To the house. To the faint tick of the mantel clock. To the memory of her voice in ink. I realized that some truths don't need to be shouted. They only need to be discovered quietly. And as I finally rose to my feet, the envelope held tightly in my hands, I understood that this was just the beginning. The house had more to tell me. And my mother had left the first words, waiting for me to hear them. The snow fell harder than I expected that morning. Soft, thick flakes blurred the road beyond the yard, leaving everything muted, quiet, as if the world itself were holding its breath. I sat on the floor, the letter open in my lap, edges curled with age, ink dark against the paper. Dust rose when I shifted, catching in the pale light like tiny ghosts. I could hear the house creak around me, settling, waiting. Her handwriting was unmistakable. Precise, careful, deliberate. It traced each word with intention, as if she had known I would need to read slowly, to feel every letter before understanding. And then I saw the name. A man I recognized. He had stood at the back of my mother's funeral. Quiet. Polite. Hands folded in front of him. He hadn't said much. Just nodded. Offered soft condolences. His eyes polite, restrained. But his presence lingered in the corner of memory like a shadow. The letter described him. Documents altered. Payments rerouted. Silence bought cheaply, in subtle, calculated increments. I traced the words with a trembling finger, reluctant, shocked, almost afraid to know. I remembered his hand on my shoulder that day, the sympathy in his voice. The softness of it now felt like a weight pressing down. Outside, the snow thickened, muting the world beyond the windows. The yard disappeared beneath white. The fence, the trees, even the far-off road became hazy shapes. I thought of all the quiet, polite voices that had surrounded us that day. How many of them had known more than they ever said? I read the paragraph again. Each sentence heavier than the last. My mother had trusted him. She had trusted people who spoke kindly, who smiled gently, who made her feel seen when others ignored her illness, her fatigue, her quiet insistence on honesty. And he had betrayed her. I pressed the envelope to my chest. It smelled faintly of her soap, of dust, of age. The smell alone carried memory, a small comfort amidst the rising panic in my chest. I wondered how long she had known. I remembered the day she signed the papers I hadn't read. She had leaned back in her chair, tired, quiet, the weight of illness and trust balanced carefully in her hand. He had spoken softly, almost too softly, guiding her. Leading her where she thought she wanted to go. I had smiled politely at him too, unsuspecting, unaware. The house shifted around me. The walls seemed closer. The floorboards beneath my knees groaned low and patient, almost reflective. I could hear the wind at the windows now, pushing against the panes, scratching faintly at the frost. The world outside felt distant, irrelevant, while inside, the truth pressed in. I stood, pacing slowly, careful not to let the quilt slip from my shoulders. The letter remained in my hand, fragile, heavy. Each step carried the echo of footsteps I had thought benign. The house creaked again, this time in response, or maybe in warning. I thought of the documents mentioned, the payments, the rerouted funds. The life my mother had built, her careful planning, her trust in others, all quietly tampered with by a man I had believed polite, sympathetic. How long had he planned this? How many others had known? Had anyone else stood quietly at her funeral, hiding the same truth in polite smiles? I sat back down, folding my knees to my chest. Outside, the snow blurred further. The road disappeared entirely beneath the white, leaving the house isolated, small, fragile. I realized the world I had known, or thought I had known, was built on half-truths and hidden hands. The letter lay open on my lap. I read the sentences again, slowly, savoring the weight of each word. The handwriting carried her voice, calm, deliberate, honest. Her final words weren't angry. Not yet. They were precise, careful, waiting for me to understand. I pressed my palm to the floor, feeling the familiar grooves of the boards beneath me. The dust shifted in the faint light. The house exhaled in its own quiet way. It had held her secrets. It had waited for me. I remembered the moment at the funeral, the light through the windows of the church. The man had been polite, quiet, holding himself at a respectful distance. Now I saw the subtle betrayal written clearly. I felt a slow, creeping disbelief that someone could be both soft-spoken and deliberate in deceit. The snow outside continued, relentless, insulating the house from the rest of the world. I could hear only the low hum of wind and the occasional creak of old timber. The envelope in my hands felt alive, almost vibrating with her careful intent. I traced her words again. The description of the man's actions, the careful orchestration of deceit, the silence he had purchased, each word a small revelation. Each line reminded me that kindness could be a mask, that polite voices could carry betrayal, and that my mother had fought quietly, writing her truth down, leaving it for me to find. I folded the letter back into the envelope slowly, letting the edges meet carefully. The weight of the truth pressed into my hands, into my chest. I rested my forehead against the kitchen floorboards. Cold, solid, familiar, grounding me, centering me. The house shifted again. A long groan through the beams, or a sigh, or both. I couldn't tell. But I knew it was listening, holding itself quiet, patient, while I absorbed the truth. The snow fell harder, draping the yard in silence. Outside, everything disappeared beneath the white. Inside, I remained with the envelope, with the man's name, with my mother's careful truth. I realized how many faces I had seen without knowing. How many hands had shaken mine while hiding secrets. The thought weighed heavy, almost unbearable. But the letter was hers. Her words. Her voice. Her courage. She had trusted me to find it. To understand. And for the first time, I understood the depth of what she had endured. I pressed the envelope to my chest one last time. The house groaned softly, dust motes drifting in the light. The snow blurred the outside world. And I knew the truth wasn't finished with me yet. Not while the man's actions waited to be confronted. Not while the secrets of the polite, soft-spoken hands remained in the open. I rose slowly, careful not to disturb the quilt, careful not to let the silence break. The letter would guide me. The house would witness. And I would begin to untangle the quiet betrayals my mother had endured, and kept, for decades. The air inside the office smelled old and warm, like heaters that had been running too long and coffee that had lost its flavor days ago. I stood near the counter, the envelope from the floorboard clutched tightly in my hands. The clerk read it once, twice, and then a third time, without looking up. Her eyes were calm, polite, professional, but her fingers tightened around the paper in a way that betrayed more than her expression did. I watched the lines of her hands, the subtle tremor that seemed to accompany the last read-through. I had expected words, confrontation, maybe even anger. But there was only stillness. The quiet hum of fluorescent lights, the faint tick of a wall clock, and the sound of my own breathing in the tiny office. She disappeared into a back room. The door swung closed with a hollow thud. I could hear the faint shuffle of papers, the scrape of chairs, the soft exhale of someone working carefully, deliberately. When she returned, her arms held a stack of files, dust motes drifting in the sunlight that escaped the blinds. Files that had not been opened in years, left to gather the silence of forgotten history. The clerk laid them on the counter without a word. I inhaled the scent of old paper, binding glue, and the faint aroma of the office's long-forgotten coffee. It mingled with the subtle, clean smell of my mother's quilt, still tucked beneath my coat, a reminder of why I was here. I opened the first file slowly, half expecting it to snap like brittle leaves. Inside were letters, invoices, signatures, ledgers, Proof of everything my mother had endured quietly. Altered documents. Payments rerouted. Notes scribbled in tiny, precise handwriting she had left for me to find. Her voice came back to me in the margins, in the faded ink. Calm, deliberate, persistent. The clerk watched me quietly, arms crossed, posture professional but tense. Her eyes flicked to the papers occasionally, then back to the door, then back to me. I realized she had seen this before, had held these documents herself, yet her reaction was restrained, as if she understood that some truths had to be discovered gently. I lifted a letter, folded carefully, edges browned. The ink was fading, but the meaning was unmistakable. She had written about trusting the wrong people. People who smiled easily while taking everything she had built. People who had hidden behind politeness and sympathy while committing quiet, deliberate betrayals. I swallowed and set the letter back down. The files smelled of age, of decisions made in silence, of mistakes that had cost more than money. The room seemed smaller now, heavier with history, each file a fragment of a life someone had tried to erase. I looked at the clerk. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. She lifted her hand, pointing toward a drawer beneath the counter. Inside were more files, tucked away neatly, labeled but long forgotten. I opened them slowly, letting the hinges creak, letting the paper speak without interruption. Invoices. Letters. Notes in my mother's handwriting, detailed accounts of signatures forged, payments diverted, assurances given under duress. I ran my fingers along the pages, imagining her hand doing the same decades ago. She had trusted people who did not deserve it. And she had written it down anyway, as if recording it could somehow protect me, even after she was gone. The clerk finally spoke, her voice quiet, almost reluctant. Your mother, she kept records. Not everyone does. She didn't raise her eyes. She didn't have to. Her hands rested gently on the edge of the counter, steady, calm. I looked around the office. The faded carpet, the half-empty filing cabinets, the smell of heaters and coffee, the dull hum of fluorescent lights. It all felt suffused with her presence. Not because she had been here, but because she had left pieces of herself everywhere, even in the quiet bureaucracy of a clerk's office. I realized that these files, these letters, these tiny inscriptions of her life, had been buried along with her voice. Hidden beneath dust, behind doors, in drawers no one opened. The clerk had handled them, had known them, had preserved them quietly. And now they were mine. The snow outside the office window blurred the world beyond. Branches disappeared into white. Cars were nothing but muted shapes. Inside, I sifted through the papers slowly, deliberately. Each document a small revelation. Each one a question answered about the life she had led, the people she had trusted, the betrayal she had endured. I lifted a letter that mentioned someone I recognized, a face from the funeral, polite, soft-spoken. The words described manipulation, diversion, quiet deceit. I remembered that person's hand on my shoulder, the sympathy in their voice. Now I understood that gestures could conceal more than words. I folded the letter carefully and placed it on top of the stack. The clerk's presence was quiet, patient. She did not rush me, though I felt the weight of time pressing in. I realized some truths take longer to absorb. They demand attention, patience, and quiet hands. The files seemed to hum beneath my touch. Each page, a small pulse of history. A heartbeat of someone who had trusted me enough to leave them behind. I pressed my palm to the counter, feeling the faint tremor of time and memory. The clerk moved away slightly, disappearing into the back again, returning with a small box. Inside were photographs, notes, clippings, more fragments of a life quietly preserved. The scent of old paper, ink, and dust mingled with the memory of my mother's quilt still on my coat. I knelt and carefully added the contents of the box to the growing pile of files. Each photograph a whisper. Each note a thread connecting me to her careful planning, her quiet endurance. I realized the office itself had become a sanctuary for her voice. The files, the papers, the letters, they had waited for me, just as the floorboard had waited years ago. I rested my forehead on the counter. Cold. Solid, real. The office hum of heaters, the low shuffle of paper from the clerk, the faint scratch of pen on file labels, it all felt alive, responsive, patient. Outside, Snow fell harder, the world blurred to white. Inside, I sifted through the evidence of her trust, her courage, her endurance. The clerk moved quietly, almost invisible, preserving the space for me to discover what had been buried along with her voice. I pressed the envelope from the floorboard into the stack of files. It belonged here now, with the letters, the invoices, the photographs, the proof of what she had endured silently. The clerk finally looked up, her eyes soft, neutral, almost resigned. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. I exhaled slowly, letting the weight of discovery settle in. The office smelled of dust, old heaters, and quiet endurance. Somewhere beneath the monotone hum of fluorescent lights, my mother's voice spoke again. Softly, deliberately, waiting for me to hear it. And I did. Careful, patient, quiet. I stood, dusting my knees, looking at the stack of files and the envelope she had hidden for me. The snow outside blurred everything beyond the window, isolating us, holding the moment steady. I understood, finally, that some truths aren't meant to shout. They wait. And when the right person discovers them, they speak. I turned to leave the office. The files, the letters, the photographs, her voice, would follow me. And I knew there were more pieces yet to uncover, waiting quietly, like snowflakes settling in silence. Snow coated the parking lot in soft white. I spotted him before he saw me. The same coat, grey and worn, the same careful smile he had worn at my mother's funeral. He stood outside the grocery store, hands in his pockets, shoulders stiff against the cold. The wind caught flakes in his hair. I could see the faint tremor in his fingers, even through gloves. He didn't notice me at first. I didn't step forward immediately. I let the cold bite at my cheeks, let the silence stretch between us. No honking cars, no bustling shoppers, just snow and the muffled sound of my boots crunching over frozen gravel. I remembered the letter in my pocket, folded carefully, edges worn, the ink still crisp with her voice. It felt heavy there, full of the truth she had left me to carry. I approached him slowly, deliberately. He turned at the sound of my steps. Recognition passed over his face, quick and subtle, replaced immediately with a practiced calm. The smile was the same, polite, careful. I didn't need to speak. I didn't want to. I placed the letter between us, on the hood of his car, letting it rest there like a small, final bridge. He looked at it, hesitated, then picked it up with slow, deliberate fingers. I watched as the color left his face. His hands trembled slightly. The wind lifted flakes from his coat, from the parking lot, as if the world itself were holding its breath. He said very little. Just enough to confirm what the paper already knew. Admissions of small deceit, rerouted payments, quiet betrayals. Words that were unnecessary because the ink had already spoken. The letter had been my mother's voice, steady and calm. It did not demand a confession. It only revealed the truth. I noticed the subtle lines at the corners of his eyes, the way his lips pressed together, the tightness in his jaw. He had practiced this smile for years, but it no longer concealed anything. The snow blurred the edge of the parking lot, muting the world beyond our small confrontation. I could see his breath, short and uneven, misting in the cold. I could hear the faint crunch of snow under my boots. I could feel the letter between us, a weight of decades pressing down softly, impossibly. I didn't ask questions. I didn't demand explanations. The paper had already asked them for me. His admission was small, fragile, like he was testing whether truth could survive outside polite smiles and carefully chosen words. I thought of my mother, of her quiet patience, of the letters she had hidden beneath floorboards and in drawers. She had trusted me to discover them, to carry the truth gently, deliberately, and now I was doing just that. I didn't speak. I let him speak the minimum he could, letting the words hang like icicles in the air. Each one confirming what I had already read. Each one revealing what he had hoped would remain buried. I shifted the letter slightly, touching the edges, letting him feel the weight of her hand in mine, even though she was gone. He flinched. I noticed how small his movements had become, how careful he was not to break the illusion of calm. It was gone now. The letter had exposed the truth. And winter has a way of exposing everything. He looked away for a moment, eyes tracing the horizon, the edge of the parking lot, the blurred trees beyond. I watched his reflection in the icy puddles at his feet. His posture slackened. The careful smile had disappeared entirely, replaced by something raw and unsettled. I realized then how long a lie can survive if no one ever asks for the truth. And how quickly it crumbles when confronted with something steady, deliberate, unavoidable. I stepped back slightly. Not because I needed space. But because the snow, the wind, the silence, it all carried weight. The letter remained between us, a small, quiet wall of truth, unmoving, unwavering. I could feel its presence pressing into my palms, into my chest, into the small, fragile space where anger, grief, and resolution collided. He finally met my gaze, and for the first time, I saw hesitation there, fear even. Not of me, but of the truth itself. It had always been there, waiting. Patient. Quiet. And now, laid bare on paper, it had no choice but to exist in the open. I stepped closer, just enough to feel the wind shift between us, to feel the snow land on the letter and cling to the edges of our hands. He didn't speak again. The words had been said. The letter had done its work. I reached out, letting my fingertips brush the edge of the paper. I felt her voice, faint but steady, threading through the ink. It was enough. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to demand justice. The snow carried its own judgment. He looked down at the paper once more. Then at me. And I saw in his eyes the recognition of time past, of actions recorded, of a life that could no longer be hidden behind politeness and smiles. The careful facade had melted with the snow. I turned and started walking away. The crunch of my boots in the snow was the only sound. He remained by the car, holding the letter, silent, still absorbing what he could no longer deny. The world beyond the grocery store was muted and white, flattened by the snowfall, leaving only the small circle of truth between us. I did not look back. I could feel the letter in my pocket now, folded again, her handwriting a quiet pulse against my fingers. It was hers. And through it, I had found the truth. The snow fell harder. It blurred the edges of the lot, the edges of the world, but it did not blur the truth. Winter has a way of exposing everything. I had learned that today. I walked toward my car, the crunch of snow beneath each step steady and deliberate. And behind me, the man in the careful coat remained, holding her voice, finally unable to hide, finally forced to meet what had been waiting for him all along. The snow continued to fall. Quiet. Relentless. True. And I carried her letter with me, knowing this was not the end, only the beginning of uncovering everything she had left behind. The keys felt cold, heavier than I remembered. I turned them in my hand slowly, one by one, letting the metal rest against my palm. Outside, the wind rattled the bare branches of the oak in the yard, sending shadows across the snow. The world had moved on without notice, indifferent, but here I was, standing at the threshold of a house that had always been mine. It smelled faintly of frost and old wood, as though it had been waiting for me to notice. Weeks had passed since the confrontation, since the letters, since the weight of truth had settled into my chest. Time moved differently in that period. Slower, quieter, measured by the soft drip of melting snow from the eaves and the faint creak of floorboards that had learned to hold secrets. No one had come to celebrate. No fanfare, no announcement. Just a small envelope from the court, and the quiet decision inside. The house was mine again. I stepped closer to the door, boots crunching over ice and scattered leaves. The lock clicked under the key, familiar yet strange, as if remembering my hand, my touch, my claim. I hesitated, feeling the air between me and the threshold thicken. Nothing inside had changed. The furniture remained in its places, the kitchen counters still bore faint stains from meals long forgotten, the chairs held the same quiet angles my mother had insisted upon. Yet everything felt different. The silence no longer pressed against my shoulders, demanding, accusing. It rested, patient, aware. The house had exhaled, or perhaps I finally understood how to breathe within it. I stepped inside, letting the door swing slowly shut behind me. The sound echoed differently, not hollow but deliberate, measured, almost like recognition. Dust motes danced in the low winter sunlight that filtered through the frost-lined windows. I ran my fingers along the banister, feeling the worn grooves, the faint warmth of memory left behind by hands that had held it for decades. I moved through the room slowly. The kitchen smelled faintly of old pine cleaner, faintly of the quilts folded on the chair. I paused at the table where my mother had shelled peas, tracing the groove she had left with her knife. I remembered her hands, careful, quiet, patient. And now, mine filled the space she had once occupied. It was mine, but it carried her weight too. I opened the living room curtains slightly, letting the daylight stretch across the carpet. The sun caught on the old photographs still hung on the walls, her wedding portrait, a faded family snapshot, the dog we had lost when I was a child. I studied each one, tracing faces, tracing lines, tracing the quiet persistence of a life she had built in careful silence. I sat in the chair by the fireplace, the one she had refused to throw away. Its cushions sagged slightly, familiar, forgiving. I felt the weight of the keys in my coat pocket, the reality of ownership pressing gently against my ribs. Justice had arrived quietly, without ceremony, without demand. And yet it was unmistakable. I thought of the men and women who had tried to take it, who had smiled while hiding deeds behind their careful voices. I remembered the letters, the envelopes, the ink that had carried her voice when she could no longer speak aloud. All of it had led here. And now, the house rested in my name. I rose and walked through the hallway, touching the walls lightly. Each floorboard creaked like it remembered, each doorframe held a subtle warmth. I could feel the house settling, adjusting to the weight of truth finally placed where it belonged. I paused by the staircase, listening. No one moved behind me, no one watched, but the quiet was alive, responsive, respectful. I opened the pantry slowly, inspecting the shelves as if they could tell me something new. Flour, sugar, and the faint scent of old spices lingered. The refrigerator hummed quietly, steady, reliable. The house did not need to announce itself. It only needed to be. I moved to the bedroom, stepping carefully over the quilt folded at the foot of the bed. It smelled faintly of her, faintly of lavender and dust. I sat on the edge of the bed, letting my hands rest on the familiar quilt. The fabric pressed softly under my palms, a reminder of patience, endurance, and quiet perseverance. Outside, the snow fell steadily. The world was muffled in white, flattened, simplified. And inside, I could feel the gentle rhythm of life returning, slow, deliberate, steady. The house exhaled with me. It did not demand. It did not accuse. I opened a drawer in the nightstand and found a stack of old letters, folded neatly, forgotten. I ran my fingers along the paper, tracing the edges. Memories surfaced, delicate, tentative. I could hear her voice between the lines, soft, deliberate, guiding me even now. The keys remained in my pocket, cold and heavy, grounding me. I pressed them lightly against my fingers, feeling the metal hum with significance. Ownership, responsibility, remembrance, it all rested in the curve of the metal. I walked to the window, looking out at the yard blanketed in white. The oak tree stretched its bare branches against the pale sky. The fence lines blurred beneath the snow. Everything outside had moved on, as it always does. But here, inside, the house waited. It had waited for me. I breathed slowly, deliberately, letting the weight of the decision settle in my chest. Nothing had been stolen from the past that remained inside. Everything had shifted subtly, quietly, but irrevocably. The house and I were aligned, our rhythms in sync. Justice had come not with fury or fanfare. It had arrived in stillness. I walked through the living room one last time, touching the sofa, the chairs, the mantel. Each surface carried the faint memory of hands that had once made it home. I pressed my palm to the floorboards, listening to the faint groan of wood underweight. It was not the groan of age. It was the recognition of return. I set the keys on the table, letting them rest in the sunlight. Cold, unadorned, familiar. I leaned back in the chair by the fireplace, the quilt around my shoulders. The silence no longer pressed. It rested. And I understood, finally, that quiet justice has a weight of its own. It does not shout. It does not demand recognition. It simply arrives, measured, deliberate, patient. Outside, the snow continued to fall. Inside, the house exhaled softly. And I listened, finally, for the sound of peace. Tomorrow, I would begin the work of living here again. But tonight, I let the stillness hold me. The house had returned to me. And in its quiet, I found the answer I had been seeking all along. Justice, I realized, sometimes looks like a set of keys resting in the palm of your hand. And silence that finally feels like home. The floorboard settled under my hand as I pressed it back into place. Dust swirled in the pale light from the window, catching in slow spirals before drifting down again. The envelope remained beneath, hidden, waiting. I lingered for a moment, palm pressed flat against the wood. Some truths don't need to be displayed to be honored. The silence of the house was patient, attentive. It exhaled gently, creaking just once, familiar now, like it remembered my mother's hands, my own. I stepped back, boots soft against the worn floorboards. The sunlight outside was dim, filtered through frost that traced delicate patterns along the windows. The air smelled faintly of pine and dust, a memory layered beneath decades of quiet life. I breathed in slowly, letting the cold mix with the warmth of the house, letting the stillness settle in my chest. I could feel her presence lingering, not pressing, just waiting. The envelope had been her voice, steady and deliberate, and now it rested beneath the floor, undisturbed but not forgotten. I moved to the kitchen, letting my fingers trail along the edge of the counters. The grooves bore faint marks from knives and peeling fruit, small scars of a life lived carefully. I ran my hand over the table where she had shelled peas, tracing the indentations she had left behind. The room smelled faintly of wax and old wood, of meals prepared in silence, of conversations held in quiet confidence. I pulled a candle from the shelf, a simple white taper, and struck a match. The flame flickered to life, painting the walls in soft amber shadows. I set it on the counter and watched it burn, steady, patient, deliberate. I thought of her hands, folded neatly in my memory, the way she pressed edges of paper flat, the way she smoothed a quilt over the bed. Had she been waiting for me to discover her voice, to carry her truth carefully, quietly? I didn't know. I only knew that the flame of the candle felt like an answer, or at least an invitation to listen. I let it burn, watching the shadows stretch and bend across the walls. Outside, the wind whispered against the windowpane, carrying the faint crunch of snow under unseen feet. I sat on the chair near the stove, letting the warmth reach my fingers. The house settled again, a gentle groan from the staircase, a sigh from the floorboards beneath the living room. It was a familiar sound now, a rhythm I had come to understand, the subtle breathing of a home that had carried generations. I traced the edge of the counter with my hand, feeling the smoothness worn down by years of quiet life. The envelope remained beneath the floorboard, its contents still present, still waiting for me to return. It was enough to know it was there. Some truths are honored simply by being held carefully, by being left untouched, acknowledged without display. I watched the candle burn lower. The flame danced with tiny bursts, flickering like a heartbeat. Each flicker threw shadows across the ceiling, stretching and contracting in a rhythm only the quiet of the house could hold. I thought of her patience, of her careful watch over small things, the meticulous notes, the folded letters, the way she preserved her life for me to find. I realized that waiting was her form of conversation, a dialogue conducted in silence, in hidden spaces, in the soft pressure of memory. The shadows on the walls shifted as the candle shrank. I leaned my head against my palm, listening. The house responded, softly, gently, as if it, too, was reflecting on what had been uncovered and what remained hidden. I felt a subtle relief, a quiet exhale, as if the air itself had carried the weight of discovery and set it down gently on the floorboards. I moved to the sink and filled a small cup with water, letting the light from the candle catch on the surface. The reflection trembled, distorted by ripples as I set the cup down. It seemed alive in the candlelight, a miniature echo of the room around me. I thought of the envelope, of the letters, of the small truths she had left beneath the floor. I thought of the time she had spent crafting them, waiting, trusting. And I realized that perhaps listening was enough. Perhaps honoring her voice didn't require revelation, only acknowledgement. I returned to the chair by the candle, watching the flame reduce itself to a tiny flicker. Outside, shadows stretched from the frost on the window, long and delicate, reaching across the walls. The house creaked once more, a familiar, settling sound that felt like reassurance. I ran my hand across the quilt draped over my knees, feeling the faint roughness of thread and stitch, a tactile memory of her care. The flame dwindled, and I leaned back, letting the soft light paint my face, letting the quiet seep into my bones. For a moment, I closed my eyes. The snow outside whispered against the roof. The wind carried a faint scent of pine, of cold air pressed into the winter sky. The house exhaled slowly around me. I could feel her presence, not pressing, not demanding, only waiting. Had she been waiting for me all along? To read her words, to feel her patience, to honor her life quietly? I didn't know. The candle burned down to nothing, leaving only a faint scent of wax and warmth behind. I exhaled slowly, letting the quiet fill the room. The house had settled completely now, the creaks and groans softened, familiar, welcoming. The envelope remained beneath the floorboard, its truths intact, honored by the stillness, unseen but acknowledged. I stood, stretching slowly, letting the stiffness in my shoulders loosen. I walked to the hallway, my fingers brushing along the walls as if to carry memory forward with each step. Each creak beneath my feet felt like recognition, like a gentle acknowledgement from the house that we had survived, that we had waited long enough. I paused at the front door, hand resting lightly on the frame. The wind carried the faintest trace of snowflakes inside, but I didn't mind. The house was quiet, settled, patient. And I understood, finally, that justice, patience, and remembrance do not always announce themselves with noise or ceremony. Sometimes, they arrive softly. I left the envelope where it had been, beneath the floorboard, unseen but honored. The house creaked again, a small familiar sigh, and I smiled faintly, knowing the rhythm of its life would continue without interference. I blew out the candle, leaving only the soft glow of daylight filtering through frost. And for the first time, the house felt like home again. Had my mother been waiting for me to listen all along? Perhaps she had. The wind whispered through the oak outside. Snow continued to drift gently against the windows. I walked to the kitchen, letting the quiet settle over me, letting her voice remain, tucked beneath the floor, waiting, patient, deliberate. And I listened.